Okay, we are back with our second lecture of the endocrine system. So when we left off with our first lecture from the endocrine system, we left off talking about target cell specificity and how there were three factors that were going to dictate how many target cells were going to be activated. Two of them, the hormone levels in the blood and the receptor levels on the target cell, were going to be able to be controllable, while the third, the hormone receptor affinity, was something that was set and was just going to be what it is. So we are going to move forward and start talking about these hormone receptors themselves. Now, I mentioned that these hormone receptors are going to be located either on the cell surface for the case of the water-soluble hormones. So in this picture here, we see the receptors are on the cell surface. So we would assume that these receptors are for those water-soluble hormones that are unable to move through the plasma membrane. These hormone receptors also could be located inside of the cell or inside the plasma membrane, and those would be for the lipid-soluble hormones. Those are not pictured here. So the thing you have to remember about living cells is that we have a tendency, especially with the way that cells are looked at in Bio 103, is that you think you have a cell, bam, and it has a nucleus, and it has a mitochondria, and it has a Golgi body, and endoplasmic reticulum, and everything. And once it is formed, it's kind of set in stone. Kind of like, you know, we relate it to the way that humans are. We have two eyes, one nose, one heart, two lungs, and that's it. We have what we have when we are first formed, and that's the way we stay till, you know, we pass away. So that's the same with cells. Cells have the capacity to add objects, add organelles according to their needs. So for instance, if a cell was going to be in an area where a high amount of cellular respiration was going to need to occur in order to produce a lot of ATP, that cell would make more mitochondria to accommodate that. So these receptors that we find either on the cell surface or we find in the cytoplasm also are going to vary in number at any point in time, and that's going to depend on the need of the cell. So if we know that if this target cell has a lot of receptors, it's going to be activated more. If a target cell needs to be activated more, it's going to add more cell receptors. Let's say if a cell is being overstimulated, and one way that it can stop being overstimulated is if it reduces the amount of hormone receptors it has, and this is exactly what will happen. And this concept of cells being able to change their structure based on needs at that particular time is referred to being as referred to as a cell being dynamic, as it being a dynamic structure, instead of it being rigid and just being what it is, and regardless of its needs, that's what it has. Dynamic means that it's going to add or subtract structures as needed. So hormone receptors that are located in these target cells are one of these dynamic structures, and the number of the hormone receptors and the sensitivity of the hormone receptors, therefore, is going to depend on the level of stimulating hormones. So when a target cell is going to perhaps be understimulated, say for instance here, there's only a small amount of hormones that are in circulation, and this cell is really being understimulated because it has to, you know, grab onto that, you know, the low levels of hormones. what the cell can do to compensate for this is that it can add more receptors either in the plasma membrane or inside the cell. And the more receptors an individual cell target cell has, the more of a chance that it's going to grab on to that low number of hormones that are in circulation. And there is a name for this process called upregulation. So upregulation is going to be when the cell increases the number of receptors on the surface of target cells or also inside the target cells. And by increasing the number of receptors, it's going to increase its sensitivity to a hormone. So an example of this is cells that are in the uterus. So cells are in the uterus. The uterus is where a growing child would develop. So there is a hormone that we're going to talk about called oxytocin. And oxytocin is a hormone which triggers contractions in the uterine muscles. So as a pregnancy progresses, the uterine muscle cells will start upregulating the receptors for oxytocin in preparation for the labor and delivery of the baby, because the more oxytocin receptors each individual uterine muscle cell has, the greater of a chance they're going to be able to be activated by the oxytocin and undergo these strong contractions in order for delivery of the child to be faster. Now, if a cell can add or up the number of receptors it has, it is also going to be able to downregulate or reduce the number of receptors that it has. So this is called downregulation, and here we have an example of a cell that has numerous receptors in the cell membrane. It also is being inundated by a large amount or a high level of hormones that are in circulation. So essentially this poor little cell is getting overstimulated. So what can the cell do? Well, the cell itself can't cause the amount or the level of hormones in circulation to go down, but what the cell can do is make itself less sensitive to the large amount of hormones that are in circulation. And to do this, it's going to undergo something called downregulation, where it's going to cut down on the number of receptors that it has. And as you can see, this cell is slowly cutting down on the number of receptors that it has embedded in its cell membrane. Nothing changes about the number of hormones that are in circulation. But now, since the cell has less receptors, it's going to have less of a chance of being activated by the high level of hormones that are in circulation. So downregulation is defined as a decrease in the number of receptors on the surface of target cells, also inside the target cells, making the cells less sensitive to a hormone or another agent. In this case, we're going to really focus on the hormone part because we're talking about these receptors in the aspect of hormone binding. So an example of this is our insulin receptors. So you may have, insulin may be a term that you've heard before, especially if you have someone that in your family that has diabetes, or even you'll hear commercials for diabetes medicine and they'll talk about insulin levels. So all of your cells in your body have insulin receptors, and these insulin receptors will bind insulin, and insulin acts as kind of a key that opens up the cell and allows sugar or glucose to move out of the blood and into the cells. Why? Well, because the cells need that sugar or the glucose in order to undergo cellular respiration. Well, if you don't have insulin, the hormone insulin, and insulin is a hormone, the cells can't be opened up and receive the glucose, so the glucose stays in the blood. Glucose stays in the blood, and it causes an increase in blood glucose levels, and that is referred to as diabetes mellitus, in fact. Well, in type 2 diabetes, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about the pancreas, individuals, this is the late onset or adult onset diabetes, individuals have basically inundated their cells, their target cells, all of their cells in their body, with huge amounts of insulin for a very long time. And this is normally due to them having a not that great diet. Say they have a very high carbohydrate, high sugar diet. So they're constantly adding glucose, taking glucose into their blood because they're eating all these high carbohydrate foods, which means that the body is constantly releasing insulin and the cells are constantly getting activated. Well, the cells kind of become numb to this after a certain point in time and they start to go and downregulate. Well, now this becomes a problem because they're downregulating because of overstimulation. Well, now the same amount of insulin is not going to activate the cells, which means that the glucose stays in circulation, and the individuals that have type 2 diabetes have chronic high blood glucose levels. So upregulation is going to add or up the number of receptors in or on the cell, and this is normally a response to a low level of hormone, allowing the cell to take advantage of the small amount of hormones that are in circulation. Where down regulation is going to cut down on the number of receptors that are in the cell or on the cell, therefore making the cell less sensitive to the large amount of hormones that are in circulation. So the hormones, the blood levels of hormones is going to always reflect some sort of balance between the amount of hormones that are being secreted and the amount of hormones that are being broken down and excreted by the liver and the kidneys. The liver and the kidneys are going to be the two organs that are going to be responsible for clearing out the hormones from the blood. Makes sense? They both filter the blood. So we have some terms here because if everything is working properly, you have an equal amount of hormones being produced and an equal amount of hormones being broken down. If you have too many more produced and less broken down, hormone levels are going to go up in the blood. If you have if you have less being produced and more being broken down, you're going to have a drop in the hormone levels in the blood. So some terminology here, the duration of hormone activity is calculated as the duration of the altered cellular behavior that is triggered by hormone binding. So how long a hormone is going to bring about a change in a particular target cell is going to depend on the duration in which it is bound to that cell. We can also talk about the amount of time that a certain hormone remains in circulation in terms of what is referred to as a half-life or a biological half-life. And a half-life is the time it takes for the hormone to lose half of its physiological activity. You actually will hear this term a lot when you talk about different medicines and different drugs. You'll talk about the half-life of the drug. And so when you talk about it that way, and also when you talk about it in hormones, say you have a concentration of, for a drug, let's say 100 micrograms per milliliter. So the amount of time it takes that drug concentration to go from 100 micrograms per milliliter to 50 micrograms per milliliter is called the half-life. Same with the biological half-life of a hormone. It's going to be the amount of time it takes the concentration of that hormone to drop by half. Now, hormones that are released are not going to always act on their own. A lot of times they do, but also a lot of times, because we have a very complicated system and a lot of different factors working together to bring about homeostasis, we see that individual hormones are going to interact with each other. And there are three terms that we use for the way that these hormones do interact with each other. And the first one is called permissiveness. And in permissiveness, we see that it's a situation where a hormone cannot exert its full effect without the presence of another hormone. So an example of this is the thyroid hormone and the epinephrine hormone. Another name for epinephrine is adrenaline. It is one of the hormones that is released in response to stress or in response to the fight, or it causes the flight or fight response. So here we have an image of a cell. And so when the thyroid hormone binds or acts on a particular cell, we see that there's going to be some sort of effect if that cell has a receptor for the thyroid hormone. But we can see one of the things that does not happen is that no fatty acids are going to be released from that cell. No fatty acids are going to be formed. Now, if we look at the same cell and it has a binding site for epinephrine, well, when epinephrine binds, there's going to be a small amount of fatty acids released. This makes sense because epinephrine, one of the things that it's going to want to do is it's going to want to provide your body with energy so that it can, fight or flight or run. However, when epinephrine and thyroid hormone together bind on the same cell, it's going to cause a large amount of fatty acid release. So essentially, we say that the thyroid hormone is permissive with the epinephrine because thyroid is going to permit, remember, permissive, permit the epinephrine to really push its activity to the limit. So as you see here, again, permissiveness is a situation in which a hormone cannot exert its full effect without the presence of another hormone. Epinephrine by itself does cause a certain amount of fatty acids to be released, but when epinephrine and thyroid hormone work together, a large amount of fatty acid is going to be released. So one permits the other one to work at its top efficiency. The next we have is antagonism. So antagonism, you probably have heard this term before. I'm trying to move this over here. Here we go. You've probably heard this term before, most likely in the in like literature, you'll hear this like the antagonist of our story. So when something is an antagonism or an antagonist, it's something that's working against something else. And this is exactly what the two hormones that are antagonists or undergo antagonism of each other. So this is going to occur when a hormone opposes or reverses the effect of another hormone. And the classic example for the antagonism is going to be glucagon and insulin. So both glucagon and insulin are produced in the pancreas. And insulin is going to cause blood glucose levels to drop. Remember, I just talked about insulin a few minutes ago, and I said insulin kind of acts as a little key that opens up the cell's ability to let glucose into the cell. So it's going to move out of the blood into the cell. So if it's moving out of the blood into the cell, what we're seeing is that insulin is going to lower blood glucose level. Now there's another hormone that is produced by the pancreas, and it's called glucagon. And glucagon is going to do the exact opposite of insulin. Glucagon is going to cause blood glucose levels to rise. And it does this by a couple different factors that we will talk about more when we get to the pancreas. But this is a classic example of an antagonist or antagonism. Insulin raises blood glucose. insulin lowers blood glucose, glucagon raises blood glucose. There's another one that we're going to talk about, the calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone raises blood calcium levels. Calcitonin lowers blood calcium levels. Again, they are going to oppose each other. The last one is called synergism. So you may have used the word synergy before. Synergism is going to, when you think of synergism, you think of things working together, okay? So in synergism, you have two hormones that are going to be able to basically do the same thing. But separately, they're only going to be able to take it to a certain level. But together, they're really going to be able to amplify this. So synergism occurs when two or more hormones produce the same effect in a target cell, and because of that, their results are amplified. Okay? So think of synergism is working together to do the same thing. So both hormones do the same thing. Let's say this one's going to bring it to this level by itself. This one brings it to this level by itself. But if they work together, they really bring it way higher. And an example of this is the hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, and another hormone that is called the antidiuretic hormone. The antidiuretic hormone also is sometimes called vasopressin. It's called vasopressin because in a large dose, in a large amount, the antidiuretic hormone, one of the effects it has is to increase blood pressure. And so we get the word vasopressin because vaso means vessel and pressin means pressure. So when the antidiuretic hormone is present in a large concentration, it actually causes blood pressure to rise. And when it is present and it in this large concentration and it does this, a lot of times antidiuretic hormone is referred to as vasopressin. For our circumstances, I'm always going to refer to it as the antidiuretic hormone, just because, I mean, why do we freaking need two names for the same thing? All right, we don't. It just makes things confusion. So we're always going to go with antidiuretic hormone, but I just want to make you aware of the fact that in some readings and in the future, if you go on in medicine, you may hear it being referred to as vasopressin. Okay, so the corticotropic releasing hormone is going to cause an increase in the corticotropic releasing hormone is going to cause an increase of the release of another hormone from the anterior pituitary called the adrenocorticotropic hormone. Now, vasopressin, I just did it again because I'm looking at it. The antidiuretic hormone also is going to cause the release of the adrenocorticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary. But when these two guys work together in a synergistic way or in synergism, it's going to result in a large amount of adrenocorticotropic release from the anterior pituitary gland. All right, so our three different hormone interactions, we have permissiveness. Permissiveness is when one hormone permits another hormone to amplify its effect. So on its own, one doesn't do anything. On its own, one does something. But when they work together, one permits the other one to release a lot more. So permissiveness permits. Antagonism, think of, the antagonist of a story. You have two characters working together, working against each other, looking for opposite results. Same thing with antagonism in hormones. One's going to do one thing, normally raise something, the other one is going to lower the same thing. And then synergism is when we have two hormones that do the same thing, that work together in a synergistic way to actually boost higher the output than either one of them could do individually. Now, regardless of how, well, let me start over. So there's always going to be a way for your body to regulate itself, always bring itself back to that, what we started talking about in the first lecture here, that state of homeostasis. And so if we have a homeostatic state and we get, perhaps our blood sugar starts to go up a little, well, what's going to happen is that our body is going to release insulin and it's going to bring it down a bit. But there needs to be a way to stop that secretion of insulin at one point, or we're going to start swinging the other way where our blood glucose levels get way too low. And the way that our body does this is by using what are referred to as feedback mechanisms. So it's going to take feedback from what is going on in the body, and it's going to turn itself off or push itself forward. Okay, so there's two types of feedback that these hormones are going to receive to help, regulate their release. There's a negative feedback system, and a negative feedback system is going to cause an opposite result. And there's a positive feedback system. And a positive feedback system is going to cause whatever the effect is that is currently going, it's going to push it to its max. And they overwhelmingly used type of this feedback mechanism is going to be negative feedback system. There are a few examples of positive feedback systems that occur in the body. I can think of two off the top of my head. One is going to involve hormones, but an overwhelming majority of the feedback mechanisms is going to be in the negative feedback mechanisms. So let's talk about the negative feedback mechanisms. So negative feedback and systems is going to be a type of regulation where the end product of the process is going to reduce the stimulus of that process. So that kind of, is kind of wordy, but essentially in a negative feedback system, if something is turned on, the feedback is going to turn it off. If something is turned off, the negative feedback would turn it on. Okay, it's going to cause the opposite result. So let me explain this example here, and perhaps that will make a little bit more sense. So here we're going to talk about some 3 different glands and 3 different hormones that are produced. So we're going to talk about the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the thyroid gland. The hormone that the hypothalamus is going to release is called thyroid releasing hormone. The hormone that the pituitary gland is going to release is called thyroid stimulating hormone. And the hormone that the thyroid gland is going to produce is called a thyroid hormone. And there are numerous examples of this kind of this guy stimulates this guy, which stimulates that guy situation in the endocrine system, which sometimes can make it very difficult for endocrinologists or doctors that work specifically with the endocrine system to figure out exactly what's going wrong. Because say, for instance, your body's not making enough thyroid hormone. Well, is it not making enough thyroid hormone because there's something wrong with the thyroid itself and the thyroid isn't producing enough thyroid hormone? Or maybe there's something wrong with the pituitary gland and the pituitary gland isn't producing enough thyroid stimulating hormone to stimulate the thyroid to make the thyroid hormone. Or maybe the problem is with the hypothalamus. Maybe the hypothalamus isn't producing enough thyroid releasing hormone to stimulate the pituitary gland to release the thyroid stimulating hormone, which is going to be released to stimulate the thyroid to release the thyroid hormone. So you can see any problem along this chain reaction can end up with not enough thyroid hormone being produced. So let's talk about how this chain of events can be controlled through negative feedback. All right, so you're going along your day, fine, and then all of a sudden there is a drop in, you have a little bit of a dip in your thyroid hormones. So that dip in the thyroid hormone is going to cause stimulation in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus will release the thyroid releasing hormone, which is going to act on the pituitary gland to tell it to release the thyroid stimulating hormone, which is going to then stimulate the thyroid gland to release the thyroid hormones. Now, once the thyroid hormones return to a regular level, it's that level itself of the thyroid hormones which is going to go back and turn off the production of thyroid releasing hormone in the hypothalamus, and also turn off the release of thyroid stimulating hormone in the pituitary, therefore having a negative feedback effect. It's going to turn it off and actually essentially stop its own production. So that is an example of negative feedback. And we see negative feedback systems all over in anatomy and physiology. It's not the first time you probably have heard one if you took 201, and it's not the last time you'll hear one here in 202. The other feedback mechanism that is not as common, like very uncommon, like I said, I can really only think of two off the top of my head, and this is one of them, and this is the only one that I can think of that has to do with hormones. A positive feedback system is going to do the opposite. Instead of turning something off if it's on, or on if it's off, it's going to turn something that's on more on, or something that is off more off, if that is a possibility. So it's going to be a type of regulation where the output of the system is going to stimulate a further increase in the output. And the classic example of this is the release of oxytocin. Now, I mentioned oxytocin before when I talked about upregulation, and I said that during the end of a woman's pregnancy, the number of oxytocin receptors that are located in the uterine muscles is going to increase, because when a woman goes into labor, the oxytocin levels throughout pregnancy are slowly creeping up. And when they get high enough that they start to stimulate or starting to bind with the receptors in the uterine muscle wall, that is when contractions start and the beginning of labor begins. Now, the oxytocin levels are going to keep increasing and keep increasing and keep increasing until that baby is delivered. And so what we see is that the initial kind of surge of oxytocin is going to be caused by the weight of the baby on the cervix, or the end of the uterus. So as the baby gets in its delivery position and the head is facing downward, there is a lot of pressure that is put on the cervix. And that pressure, that stretching of the cervix, actually causes nerve impulses to be sent to the brain. And the brain says, oh, this baby's getting a little bit heavy in here. We should probably release a little bit of oxytocin to try to get this thing moving, because the baby's getting a little heavy. So it releases oxytocin, the uterus starts to contract, and when something contracts, well, now there's more pressure. So now the baby puts even more pressure on. The brain says, oh, wow, that's a lot of pressure down there. Send some more oxytocin. And it just keeps going and going and going and going, and more oxytocin and more contractions and more oxytocin and more contractions, until finally the baby is delivered and that pressure from the baby is completely removed and the contractions immediately stop. like I said, this is the only one that I can think of that is a positive feedback system. And as you can see, it keeps pushing onward more. There is a limit. And, you know, when you get to that ultimate limit, in this case, it is the actual delivery of the baby, then everything kind of stops. If you have ever heard of anyone getting their labor induced, a lot of people are induced with labor. The drug that they give them is called Pitocin, Pitocin. Pitocin is a synthetic version of oxytocin. And when a woman is given the Pitocin, it kind of it binds to those same receptors, and it starts uterine contractions in hopes that the body will recognize that, the brain will recognize it, and then you'll start producing your own oxytocin to levels to get that pregnancy, the delivery going. So a woman might be given a large dose of Pitocin to kind of kick and trick her own body into start producing the oxytocin, which naturally would be produced to cause the baby to be born. If a pregnancy, if a delivery starts to slow down, say the woman has been in labor for quite a long time, it's not uncommon for them to get injections of Pitocin to help move the labor along, to make it a little bit easier, and get that baby moving on its way out. So you may have heard of Pitocin if you've ever had anyone in your family give birth. It's a very common drug that's given to women during labor. Come on, over here. Oh, here we go. Okay, so we have successfully gone over all of the information that we need to go over, talking about different hormones and how they get into cells, how they activate, how receptors are going to act, what target cells are, the classification of hormones, how they bring about changes in the cell, which is kind of really the boring part of the endocrine system. So now we're going to start talking about the part that everyone likes to hear about, and that is the different glands and the different hormones that they produce and what they bring about. So we're going to start off in the brain. We're going to start at the top and go our way to the bottom. So our first major endocrine gland that we're going to talk about is the pituitary gland. So this is actually a human who has been, cut down the middle, medial cut straight down the middle. So this would be their nostril here. This is the roof of their mouth. This is the brain. This is their brain stem. These right here are actually the sinuses. These are back neck muscles. This up here is the scalp. But we have this picture here because right here, hanging off of the end of the brain, is this small little pea-like structure. And that's our first gland we're going to talk about, the pituitary gland. So the older name for the pituitary gland is called the hypophysis. Now, if you read any textbooks nowadays, I doubt that you're going to run into the term hypophysis, but it was the original term that was used for the pituitary gland. Because of this, some of the structures that are involved in the pituitary gland still have the hypophysis kind of nomenclature in it, and you'll see that in a few minutes. But for our purposes, we're always going to refer to it as the pituitary gland, and you should really only see it nowadays referred to as the pituitary gland. So it's located at the base of the brain, right there. It is a little tiny pea-size organ, but it is a complete and separate organ from the brain. It's not part of the brain. It is completely separate from the brain, even though it is kind of attached to the bottom of it. So here we have the pituitary gland right here. This is from the book Gray's Anatomy, which was written, good Lord, probably back in I would say at least like the 1800s. Here you can see it's called the hypophysis. So that is kind of an antiquated term for it, but this is the pituitary gland. It is again at the base of the brain. There is a little indentation actually in the skull in which the pituitary gland sits. The pituitary gland is split into anterior and posterior. So anterior is going to be the part that is closest to the front. Anterior is the front portion of our body. The posterior pituitary is going to be on the back side of the body. So posterior, think of posterior, it's like, you know, your butt. So posterior is going to be on the back. Now, the pituitary gland is going to be attached to the brain, or specifically to the part of the brain that's called the hypothalamus, and it's going to be attached by this very thin stalk right here. So this is the hypothalamus up here. This is the thin stalk that is going to connect the pituitary gland, and the thin stalk is called the infundibulum. So it's actually labeled here, the infundibulum, and it's not very thick at all. I'm trying to think about something. It's like about the thickness of really like a piece of yarn. For those of you who don't know, I work in a brain collection, and I have seen hundreds of human brains, and a lot of times, well, I would say a majority, probably like 97% of the time that we get a brain removed from a skull, the pituitary gland is not attached still, because it is so small and the infundibulum is so thin that when you take it out of the skull, it kind of just stays in there. So it's a very small structure, really small considering all of the effects that it has on the body. So the pituitary gland is often referred to as the master gland because it was known that the pituitary gland produced a lot of hormones that actually controlled other endocrine glands. But much later, after it was given the term master gland, it was discovered that the pituitary gland is actually under control of the hypothalamus. So again, this would be our hypothalamus here. This is our infundibulum. This is total together. This is our pituitary gland. This is the anterior pituitary gland, which would be towards the front of the body. And this is the posterior pituitary gland, which would be towards the back of the body. So even though we still refer to the pituitary gland as the master gland, really, I guess we should really have renamed the hypothalamus the master gland, because the hypothalamus controls the pituitary, and then the pituitary controls everything else. So one of the ways that the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland is through neurons or nerve cells. So in the anterior pituitary gland, there are particular nerve cells that are called the parvocellular neurons. And these parvocellular neurons are going to travel down and send messages that are going to be received by blood vessels, and then the blood vessels are going to transfer the messages to the anterior pituitary gland. One of the ways that the hypothalamus is going to control the posterior pituitary gland is through a group of neurons called the magnocellular neurons. And the magnocellular neurons are going to extend down the entire length of the infundibulum and run directly into the posterior pituitary gland. All right, so let's start off by talking about the anterior pituitary gland. So the anterior pituitary gland, again, has a antiquated name that is called the adenohypophysis. Again, I'm never going to use adeno hypothesis, but we want to let you know, I want to let you know that that's there because of, you know, in case it comes up in the future. So the anterior pituitary is composed of true glandular tissue. It is composed of endocrine cells that are going to produce hormones and then excrete those hormones into the extracellular space, into the interstitial fluid, and then be taken up by the blood vessels and distributed throughout the entire body. One way that the hypothalamus is going to also communicate directly to the anterior pituitary is through one of those portal systems that I talked about in the first lecture. Remember, a portal system is a system of blood vessels that is going to allow some substance to have a direct route from one place to the next, or from point A to point B, or in this case, from the hypothalamus directly to the anterior pituitary. And so the name for this group of blood vessels that is going to deliver hormones produced by the hypothalamus directly to the anterior pituitary to stimulate the endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary, this portal system is called the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. All right, so hypothalamic is from hypothalamus, and hypophyseal is from that old term for the pituitary gland. Remember, I told you that we don't call the pituitary gland the hypophysis anymore, but you're going to see that term because some of these structures have that term in it. So essentially, the name hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system means from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, aka hypophysis, portal system. And portal system is, again, that direct connection of the blood vessels. So the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system is a system of blood vessels that connects the hypothalamus directly to the anterior pituitary. And here it is right here. So we have this part of the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system that is going to pick up the hormones secreted by the hypothalamus, and bam, they're going to be transmitted directly down here to the target cells inside of the anterior pituitary. Those target cells are endocrine cells themselves, and they're going to stimulate those endocrine cells to produce another form of hormones, or another type of hormones. So essentially, this portal system is going to allow direct communication between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary using hormones. And when I was talking about the negative feedback system, remember I said the hypothalamus produced the thyroid releasing hormone that stimulated the pituitary gland to release the thyroid stimulating hormone. Well, how does that happen? Hypothalamus makes that thyroid releasing hormone. It gets taken into the portal system, travels down here, gets attached to its target cells in the anterior pituitary, and causes those cells to produce the thyroid stimulating hormone, which is then taken up in the blood, travels down to the thyroid, and attaches to the target cell in the thyroid gland itself. So the anterior pituitary is going to itself produce and secrete 7 different hormones. So we're going to talk about all 7 of them. I'm going to say what the target organ for that hormone is going to be, and then we're going to discuss what the effect is. So what is going to change in that target organ when the particular hormone binds to it. So the first one is called the follicle stimulating hormone. So the follicle stimulating hormone, the targets are going to be the gonads. In females, that's going to be the ovaries. In males, that is going to be the testes. So the effect of the follicle stimulating hormone when it binds the target cells in the respective gonad is going to be to cause the growth and development of the reproductive system. The next hormone is called the luteinizing hormone. Again, the target is going to be the gonads, ovaries in females, testes in males. And what the luteinizing hormone is going to do is it's going to cause the gonads to produce different sex hormones. So we're talking about estrogen, progesterone in women, and to a limited amount, testosterone in women, and in men, testosterone. The next hormone is called the adrenocorticotropic hormone. It's a very, very long term. You will often see it abbreviated ACTH for adrenocorticotropic hormone, corticotropic hormone. So if we look at this word, the first part is adreno, and that's going to give you a hint of what the target for this hormone is going to be, because the target is going to be the adrenal glands, those glands that sit on top of the kidneys. So that's where we get the adreno part. Now, the cortico part has to deal with the fact that it's going to stimulate those adrenal glands to release hormones of their own. Specifically, it's going to cause it to release the cortico hormones, hence cortico. So there are three types of cortico hormones that the adrenal glands are going to be able to produce. There are the glucocorticoids, the mineralocorticoids, and the sex corticoids. And the last part of this word, tropic, a tropic hormone is going to promote the secretion of another hormone. So if we have a tropic hormone, it's going to be one of those hormones that's released from gland A, and it's going to travel to gland B and make gland B secrete a hormone. So yes, it's a long word, but if you look at how the word is made up, it kind of tells you what it does. Adreno targets the adrenal glands. Cortico, it targets the adrenal glands to release those cortico hormones. And tropic means that, basically, again, it causes them to release hormones. What hormones? The cortico hormones. So target is the adrenal glands. The effect is stimulate the secretion of glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids, and sex corticoids. And we will talk about these when we talk about the adrenal glands. The fourth hormone that the anterior pituitary emits or secretes is called the thyroid stimulating hormone. And we've talked about this one a couple times already now because it was used as an example. So the thyroid stimulating hormone, what is it going to stimulate? It's right there in the name. It's going to stimulate the thyroid gland. And the effect is that it stimulates the secretion of thyroid hormones. Again, the thyroid stimulating hormone it can be abbreviated TSH, and it itself is going to be stimulated by the release of thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. The fifth the fifth is hormone that the anterior pituitary gland is producing is called prolactin. So when you hear the word lactin, you might think of lactating or lactation. And if you know what lactation is the production of milk in mammary glands. So prolactin targets ovaries and mammary glands, and when prolactin is present in large amounts, it's going to not only influence the secretion of estrogen and progesterone, but it's also going to cause the formation or allow for the formation of milk in the mammary gland. So interesting thing about prolactin is both males and females produce prolactin. So prolactin is produced all the time in the body, but it is suppressed by another substance. And during pregnancy, the substance that suppresses it slowly lowers. And so prolactin sort of is able to take on its full effect and cause the production of milk and allow for women to lactate, therefore feed their youngs. But men also have prolactin, and I'm not saying that a man could, I mean, I guess he could if you like gave him a whole bunch of, I mean, the equipment's there, prolactin, but, you know, men make it too. So, you know, stranger things have happened, shall we say. Okay. The sixth, right, 3, 4, 5, 6, yes, sixth type of hormone that the anterior pituitary produces is the growth hormone. Growth hormone is going to target your liver, your adipose tissue. Growth hormone is going to promote growth of the body, the muscles, through lipid and carbohydrate metabolism. So it allows for the release of energy in order for the body to, you know, muscles to get more dense and bones to grow longer. It's what is going to stimulate expansion or growth at the epiphyseal plate. The growth hormone, or human growth hormone, is what our topic, our class 4 topic is about what is referred to as cosmetic endocrinology, and how some people are choosing to give their children human growth hormone, even if they don't need it, in order to make them, you know, 1 or 2 inches taller. But, you know, we're not really sure if we should be doing that, you know, because there are side effects of doing this. But it's an interesting article. I want you to read it and give your opinion on that. We're missing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We're missing one. Polygonal, luteinizing, anterior growth. What is the one that we're missing? All right, so I guess we're going to stop this here because I can't think of the one that we're missing, and we will pick up our next lecture, adding the one that we've missed or I've missed on here, and also talking about the posterior pituitary. Go down here, start this up, and